keep it kind of simple. I've got all my notes and I've got all my visuals. If there's stuff you guys want to look at or you want to ask about, stop me at any point and say, hey buddy, shut up a second, I got a question. We'll start here.
Be a little more polite than that.
You know what? Folks around here do tend to be more polite than that. So, see, I'm a New Yorker. We're a lot more crass over there. So guys, the first place we're gonna go to is basically where Dr. Sachs starts. Jack Kerouac says at the beginning of that book, the other night I had a dream. I was sitting on the sidewalk on Moody Street, Lowell, Pawtucketville, Mass, with a pencil and paper in hand. Okay, well, Jack actually visualizes himself sitting on this sidewalk right here. In fact, this is the wrinkly tar corner. That doorway at 182. In fact, this building has remained pretty consistently architecturally the same since Jack's day. That's the doorway that Jack and his friends George Apostolos and Freddie Bertrand and Billy and who comes before that? Because Billy Chandler sat with him there, but who am I missing? And then, oh, Scotty Bullo and Roland Salvis. So they used to sit there, and all they do, because this is so much more open, they could see all the way across into the city of Lowell. You could see the clock, right? And they just sit there and they kind of goof off, listen to the sights and sounds and the memories. So this is the starting point of the book. We have a clear geographical starting point of Dr. Sachs, although, of course, the book is really taking place in Jack's head because he tells us he's dreaming this. And we have a clear ending point, which is over at the grotto. So this is where the book starts. As I told you guys already, about 2 straight blocks down here, which used to be called Moody Street. All of the locations back and forth on that street are places Jack writes about. So what we'll do is we're actually going to go down a couple of blocks, and then we're going to hang a left up into the neighborhood where Jack lived for a number of years in the mid-1930s. Now, this building, as you may be able to guess, also wasn't here. There was a big home that belonged to the Charbonneau family. The Charbonneau family, okay, the matriarch in that family was named Philomena, and she had a son named Armand Charbonneau. And Armand Charbonneau was not just one of Leo's good friends because they were connected to the Pawtucketville Social Club, which we'll go by in a little bit, but he was friends enough that he used to come over to these quite exuberant parties the Kerouac family would have in their home on Sarah Avenue. So this place is where a guy who Jack renamed either Shabby or Shammy, who supposedly had a big crush on on Jack's aunt, and he thinks that's what brought him over to the parties. But if he got really, really drunk, he didn't have to worry about falling down very far because it was all pretty close to him. The time he spends in Pawtucketville was dotted with any number of tragic events, including a number of deaths that really impacted Jack. So if you've ever read Dr. Sachs, you know, it's dark in its own weird way with, like, you know, the vampires and the, you know, the battle for good versus evil and the big castle on the, you know, on Snake Hill in Centerville. By the way, that's all based on a real place over in Centerville that you guys have probably, you know, if you've driven around in that area at all, you've probably driven right by it numerous times. Now, in Jack's day, beyond this little park, which is called Fells Park, this all used to be open and it had no grass on it. It was just like a sand dune. So this was one of what Jack called sandbanks. So if you read Dr. Sachs and you ever hear him talking about a sandbank, well, where is he talking about? The first of them was right here. and it extended all the way down to this next intersection with Bodwell Avenue. This was a place where Jack and his friends used to play like their army games and like, you know, their Monster Man games. But it was a place for great adventure, and it was so open, okay? And they get running starts and they just jump down and roll down the hill. That's how big and expansive it was. And Jack also tells us, just because it's a passage from the book, he gives this brilliant description. Now imagine with no science center here, the views you had of the Merrimack River, the views you had over in the Centerville. So this hill, and being up on top of that hill, would have put us right across the road from one of Jack's homes. The second house in, and Jack describes this, that's where his friend George Apostolus, he calls him GJ in his book. Probably Jack's best friend during his adolescence. But they would just hang out up there, and because there was so much open area, it was like basically, for a kid with a vivid imagination, it was the biggest playground imaginable. Now, have you all read Dr. Sachs?
Bits and pieces.
Bits and pieces. Well, Dr. Sachs is one of Jack's stranger books, because Dr. Sachs is in fact a blend of fantasy and reality. On one hand, it's Jack's riff on one of his favorite fictional characters, the Shadow. You know, if you guys have never heard of the Shadow, he was a popular radio serial character and pulp magazine or pulp book character, okay? And that made for lots of nights huddled under your sheets, you know, with your cat curled up on the bed. As Jack says, all of this was born under the sheets with my cat and a candy bar, right? So all of this area here, Jack could play games like, you know, he was the Shadow, and he has his own version of the Shadow when he dresses up, who he calls the Black Thief. But the Black Thief is really just an immature version of the title character of the book, Dr. Sachs. And Dr. Sachs is like this weird combination, like a superhero, a detective, a witch doctor, an imaginary friend, but he's the title character in this book. So, we are going to cross the street in a second, but I want to stop right here at this kind of intersection, point out, none of this was like this. Now, there's still athletic fields, but there used to be a big baseball field. It wasn't the official college baseball field, it was sort of a practice field. The football field was all through here. So this was still filled with kind of athletic complex. And all Jack had to do was jump the hill and go down here, and he and his friends, however many of them they could get to come out, would play. There also happened to be an Olympic-sized track out there. So if you ever read Dr. Sachs, and Jack is talking about, we were staging like track meets out on track. It was right here that he did that. So these kids had the best of a lot of different worlds. So that first sandbar extended all the way to this intersection. So just go all the way to see the big building. So that whole vast expanse you could play in. But that was the smaller of two sandbanks, because the other one started right here on the other side of Bodwell and went down 3 full blocks to Spark Street, okay? So these kids had it pretty good when it came to like places to play in. So Dr. Sachs is for Jack this character that kind of accompanies him when he leaves Centerville, okay, the other side of the river, and comes over here. He's a really freaked out little kid when he gets over here, because he's lost his idol, his older brother Gerard. He barely remembers his brother. He's a sensitive kid. He has a lot of typical fears. So one of the reasons why he invents this sort of persona, Dr. Sachs, I think, is to have a protector figure. He becomes sort of a father figure, but at the same time, just a version of his burgeoning imagination, because Jack had a very active imagination. And we know that he was already writing by age 10. And whether he was just doing write-ups of his little imaginary horse races he was having, whether he was just writing up like this little, he had his own version of like like almost like Stratomatic card baseball that he would play as a kid. He invented all this stuff himself. So he started writing newspaper columns about these imaginaries, like, and we have text, hundreds of pages of text of him writing about this. So Jack's first writings were actually kind of sports journalism, but completely made up from his mind. So we get a chance here in just a second. I think after this car we should be able to go. I want to show you guys exactly where Jack first meets Dr. Sachs, because he catches glimpses of Dr. Sachs all around here. Underneath the bridge, you know, behind a dark tree, between the stations at the grotto. But his first meeting with Dr. Sachs actually takes place, would have been basically behind this blue house on a rise in the larger of the two sandbanks. Jack is out there one night, and like some kind of king of Lowell, he's standing on the hill looking over his kingdom, okay, and just thinking, wow. And he gives you a beautiful play-by-play. He tells you about the old cemetery on the hill down there. You can see it's actually a real cemetery, Hamlet Cemetery. Drake at Tigers Field, the little scrub baseball field that they used to play most of their games on. He tells you about the bridges you can see, the little rickety grocery store down the corner. So he's in the midst of all of this thought, and all of a sudden a light flashes, and Dr. Sachs is standing next to him. And that happens, well, let's place it right there where all those great solar panels are, okay? And he's like, what do you want, Dr. Sachs? And Dr. Sachs starts talking to him, but Jack doesn't understand a damn word he's saying. Speaking in this weird kind of, I don't know, like a mix of like hipster jive and like, you know, witch doctor lingo, and Jack is a little bit lost. But the one thing Dr. Sachs does say to him, he says, well, I'm here to pay a visit to your old buddy Gene Plouffe. And Gene Plouffe lives out at the end of the street. So Dr. Sachs says to Jack, do you want to come with me? And Jack is like, sure, sure. So what they do, and we're not going to walk down there any farther, they start running across people's backyards all the way. And Jack describes jumping the fences, dodging, you know, all the lawn furniture and, you know, the kids' toys in the backyard. And he gives us a blow-by-blow account of this street, which is Phoebe Avenue. Now, Phoebe, with this nice big house here, the tallest one, from that house all the way down, none of this was here in Jack's day. But all of the houses were here on this side of the street. So Jack and Dr. Sachs are leaping fences, going down the backyard. He tells us about the family who lives here, their daughters, and he's noticed the daughters before, in a rather innocent way, I guess. One of Jack's really, really good friends. Oh, excuse me. One of Jack's really good friends, a gentleman named Leo Nadeau and his brother, T. Nadeau, they live here. They were good enough friends that the Nadeau brothers drove Jack and his father. When Jack had to go back to college at the beginning of the 40-41 school year, they were the ones who drove him. But Leo Nadeau was also on the high school track team with Jack Kerouac. So he gets in their backyard, he can hear the radio playing. And he stops and listens for a second. But then a light comes on and they have to keep moving. Now, I imagine Jack actually did this little sprint through the backyards. And he keeps walking down the street, and he's going by these houses, and he will hear occasionally somebody's family pet. He will hear a voice that he recognizes, and it's all really cool. And Jack realizes, Tijan realizes, Tijan Douloise, which is what Jack calls himself, that Dr. Sachs knows like he's been here before. Well, again, he's just a version of Jack, so of course he's been here before. But all of the surprises that happen are, you know, kind of pile up. But Jack is still having a hard time understanding what this guy is saying. They get to this backyard, and they stop for a moment. And I do want to tell you a little bit about the young man whose family used to live here. 30 Phoebe Avenue was formerly the home of the Chandler family. Jack calls them the Hampshire family. In fact, there's a character named Dickie Hampshire. Dickie Hampshire is based on one of Jack's very best friends. His name was Billy Chandler. Billy Chandler died very tragically during the Bataan Death March in World War II. But he is one of the number of Jack's friends and confreres who either died or were seriously injured in World War II. What makes this death all the more tragic is this young man was a burgeoning artist. He was a really good actor. He was involved in local theatrical productions. He, in fact, was the art editor for the magazine that he kind of organized in Manila in the Philippines, which is where he was stationed for a period of time. The military all had their little private publications. So Jack actually names as characters the mother, father, and 3 brothers from this family. And they're mentioned in repeated stories. So this is an important house in Kerouac lore, but sadly, when Jack writes about it in Dr. Sachs, he has in the back of his mind, this is a house where something, tragic ultimately happened, although it didn't happen here. Real tragic thing, Billy Chandler died in 1942. It took until 1945 to get his remains back in the United States, sadly. So, I don't know where each and every one of you grew up, but did you ever have like a crabby old man who lived in your neighborhood?
Oh, yeah.
Okay. Well, the crabby old man in Jack's neighborhood lived in this house right here. His name was Alphonse Noel. Alphonse Noel. He renames him in Dr. Sachs, but here's what makes this house and this character kind of interesting. When Jack was playing with his friend, now if you look, just the second house from the end is where his buddy George Apostolos used to live. I was telling you about that house. Well, George and Jack were out in the street just throwing the ball back and forth. And I guess they threw it and it either hit this house or made a noise. The old guy, Alphonse Noel, came out and screamed at the two of them. Get off my property, that typical kind of thing. And they were kind of freaked out about that. Not long after that, Alphonse Noel dies. In fact, he dies in May of 1935. And on the night his body was carted out, of the home into the hearse, Jack and his friend GJ were out there and watched this happen. And Jack describes this scene, and he still remembers the sounds of the men's feet as they're kind of splashing in the puddles as he brings them out. So, death in the house 2 doors down from this one. Death in this house here. There used to be an impressive tree in the front yard of this home. This was sort of the batty old cat lady kind of character who would probably be voting Democrat in the upcoming election, I'm assuming, but who lived here, And ladies and gentlemen, this is the first house that Jack Kerouac lived in from 1932 to the end of 1934. This is his first house in Pawtucketville. It's here where he first starts creating some of the games and starts doing writing with any kind of real discipline and purpose. The backyard, he had his own, there used to be like a ham curing shack or something back there. So he actually used to hang out back there, made it his clubhouse. And there was a hole in the roof that he could just fit through. So when he was doing his things like running around the backyards and he needed to get out of sight real quick, he could dive in there. But when he goes down the street at night with Dr. Sachs, when he gets here, he stops for a second and goes, there's my old house. He's trying to tell Dr. Sachs this, but Dr. Sachs has got his own prattle going on. Well, anyhow, they get here and Jack looks and he goes, I remember there's a new family that lives here now. They've got 8 children. In fact, they had 8 daughters, And that's part of the reason that Jack mentions it. But Jack ends his description of this house on kind of a slightly elegiac note, I guess, just a little tinge of sadness. Well, in 1954, the man of the house, a gentleman named George Pearsall, the father of those 8 daughters, was actually killed, when responding to a robbery at a factory on the other end of town, kind of more on the south end of Lowell. He was a police officer. He was a veteran detective. He'd been working for the police force for 17 years, I believe. He responded, caught somebody in the act, he got shot. It is the oldest unsolved murder in the history of the city of Lowell. It's the coldest of cold crimes. Now, Jack's description of it sounds kind of prophetic, like, oh, he knew that this guy died. Well, Jack actually wrote Dr. Sachs 2 years before that death happened. So there's something very creepy about the description, knowing that he wrote about something and cast it as being somehow tragic. Although the family who lived here were completely delightful people. You used to see stories about their daughters all the time because they were on the baton twirling squad, and they were like a whole bunch of them, like Russian nesting dolls, were all on the team together. So this is Jack's first house. He had a good time here. He enjoyed being here, and while here one night, just sitting on the front steps, a kid goes by on roller skates, walks up to Jack, he says, "Who are you?" He says, "Well, I'm Jackie, who are you?" He says, "Well, me," he says, "you know, I'm Zach Plouffe." Well, at least that's the name he gives him in Dr. Sachs. Well, the person who came up to him, in fact, was a young man named Roland Hood. Ninip was his nickname. They all have very, very, you know, almost comical nicknames. So the first friend Jack makes is 3 days after he moves into this house, and he becomes kind of an enduring pal. Now, I want you just to remember that name, either Zach Plouffe or Roland Hood, because when we get around the corner, there's a slightly heavier story that we need to tell about him. So this house, in 1938, the gentleman who lived in this house, okay, perished the result of an epileptic seizure he had in the basement one night while chopping wood, okay, and because his father was friends with this gentleman and they just lived around the corner, here's another death. So guys, you've got death. During the time he lives here, he's got people dropping like flies. And for a really sensitive kid like Jack, this made an enormous impression. Now, George Apostolos lived here. George Apostolos had an older brother named Peter Apostolos. They used to call him in the neighborhood the professor. He was so smart, but he was disabled very, very badly, and he never left the house. He basically either sat in his chair or in a wheelchair his entire time. He died in the early 1940s, and of course that was communicated to Jack through letters from his friend George Apostolos. But these guys, Jack and George, were as thick as thieves. And when he was interviewed in the 1970s for some Kerouac biographies, he provided some of the most potent anecdotes about the things they used to do. And they were close. What made him an odd choice for best friend? He's one of the very few non-French Canadian people in this neighborhood. He's Greek. And at the time, if something bad happened in Pawtucketville, in this neighborhood, they're like, it's probably those dirty Greeks who did it, because everyone who was an ethnic other was suspect. But it didn't take long for people to embrace him, because the mother, who was very, very devout, you know, never spoke English, only ever spoke Greek, became sort of a popular character in the neighborhood. Now, that little boy that Jack made friends with, in fact, lived right here in this house. So he didn't roller skate very far. This is the home right here of the Hood family. Theo Team and Marie Hood raised 10 children in this house. Not a large family by French Canadian standards. I researched some families that with as many as 12 and 15 kids, but Jack was friends with a whole big bunch of them. In fact, the most famous member of this family has his name on that telephone pole right there. His name is Pete Robert Hood. Pete Robert Hood was a World War II hero. Okay, he was a prisoner of war in Germany. He spent 7 months in a German stalag just outside of Munich. When he came back, he brought with him what you would think would be lots of bad behaviors, maybe he would drink. No, he turned out to be this incredibly productive citizen. He was involved in Franco-American civic life. He was president of many of the fraternal organizations, especially the ones of Franco-American variety. He was involved in veterans organizations. He became an election commissioner.
They found us. They found us.
They did find us.
We're waiting. We're waiting for you at Cumnock.
So where the hell is he?
Oh,
He went for Bill.
well, you know, we thought maybe people were just not coming because it had started raining a little bit.
Yeah, I say I always wait for the Worthen to wash up.
Okay. Well, I was just telling folks, and for those of you who are interested, you need to know this name that's on that historical mark. This has been dedicated. The reason it's there is because this is the house Pete Hood and his brother Mike Hood, who are Gene and Joe Plouffe and Dr. Sachs. Okay, they were, in addition to both being war heroes, okay, they were also two of the best baseball players that the city of Lowell ever produced. They played on the Twilight League teams, they played on CYO teams. I've got clippings that show that they played on their respective military teams. For a while it looked like they were gonna like do nothing but play baseball and serve as kind of ambassadors, but they both ended up in combat, one in Europe, one in the Pacific. And as I was just saying, Pete Hood ended up a German prisoner of war. His escape from this Stalag outside of Munich, Germany, made the front pages of the Lowell Sun, and it's a pretty harrowing story. One of the things that saved him was that he spoke fluent French because they're a Franco-American family. So he was able to speak fluently, at least as fluently as a Lowell French-Canadian person could speak with a Parisian French person.
That's a tough act to do.
Yes, yes,
Yeah.
it is.
It's a tough, that's a whole different lingo.
Yeah, but he ended up being able to do so. Contacted members of the French resistance, the French underground, who provided him with clothes. The one thing that they didn't have for him was shoes that fit. So the thing he was always most worried about was that he would get caught because they'd recognize his American military shoe. Now, thankfully that didn't happen. But when he came back, he got all of the, a laundry list of medals, okay? He was injured in the war, he got a Purple Heart, but he actually turned out to be a pretty remarkable guy. One of the most modest headstones in St. Joseph's Cemetery is for him, and he's a war hero and a hero within the Franco-American community. He and his brother used to play. Now, just imagine when this building wasn't here. There was a home here the Charbonneau family lived in, but this was all open. And then it kind of takes a sort of a left turn, and it was open all the way to what used to be Moody Street. That park, that unofficial park, is a place that was considered the most haunted in the neighborhood. And the reason for that, as I already started telling some of the folks, the first friend that Jack made in the neighborhood was this young man named Roland Hood, Ninip Hood. 16 Phoebe, where he lived. This guy came right up in his roller skates and greeted Jack 3 days after he moved here. Well, Ninip Hood ended up dying in a really, really gruesome accident that Jack Kerouac also witnessed, okay? And it happened right on this street. There used to be door-to-door milk delivery back in the day. This would have been in 1938. And a gentleman named Ernest Beauchesne, he was called Patty, he was, I guess, a French-Irish, you know, Irish, French-Canadian, was driving his milk wagon that day. And you kind of didn't really drive the milk wagon, you just sort of guided the horse and let it do its thing. Because even when you weren't on it, the horse was trained to slowly kind of keep moving forward. So you could run, grab a new bottle of milk, put it on this person's horse, put it on this person. Well, it was considered a great privilege amongst the kids in the neighborhood to help Mr. Beauchesne deliver his milk. And one of the people who did it on this particular morning was Roland Hood. He ran to get back up on the milk wagon to get a bottle of milk. His foot slipped on the little metal step, got tangled up in the spoked wheel of the horse-drawn wagon, and he started being dragged down the street. First thing he does is scream bloody murder. The horse takes off. And he was dragged for a long enough distance that tendon in the back of his foot was cut, his heel, all of the flesh was just torn off down to the bone. And Jack and other kids were out because they were also interested in helping, but also they were getting ready for the school day. They finally stopped the horse-drawn cart. They got the young Hood boy to St. Joseph Hospital. all appeared to be going well until gangrene set in his foot, and he died in July. Okay, the accident happened in May. Jack witnessed this accident.
Can I ask a question before we move on?
Yeah.
Oh, I showed him the house, 35 Sarah.
Yeah.
But,
Yeah, 35 Sarah is right down here. This is 16
oh,
Phoebe.
yeah, that's, which one is that? Oh, yeah, that's right. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Go ahead,
So
Jim.
the question is, how old is this neighborhood? Because it looks like all the houses were built at the same time. And is it the French Canadians who move in first?
Yes, that's a great question. Okay. You had one of the greatest population densities of any place on the face of the earth just across the river in Little Canada. So when you get across the bridge, you know, spanning out kind of this way and that way, but down several blocks, that was entirely Franco-American, all French Canadian. Well, those people got sick of living in those really tight quarters. There was a lot of illness. There was a lot of, you know, I mean, there were benefits to living there. All of the businesses were run by French Canadian people. You know, you could walk in and speak French if you were going to the meat market, if you were going to, you know, going to the doctor's office, because it was all there. It was like its own little self-contained world. But they started feeling like they wanted to, you know, what is it that we do nowadays? We escape to the suburbs. So this area, okay, at the very, very beginning of the 20th century, okay, so about 1895 to 1900, they started building houses through here. Now, some of these houses are far older than that, but if you look, the similarity in the architecture suggests they're all built about the same time.
Yes.
And by the way,
Yes.
the number of houses, if you count them here, is the same number of houses that was here the day Jack lived here. In fact, it was the same number of houses when his father first arrived here in 1911. So this area hasn't changed very much at all. It's pretty much the same. And when Jack describes the number of homes on this street, and you go, he tells you the exact number, and it's not only the same number, it's the same distribution. These are all the same buildings that have been here since Jack's day. So, guys, this corner, okay, being named for Robert Hood is not just a wonderful tribute, of course, to, you know, this war hero and, you know, legendary Lowell athlete, but it also, I think, serves as a tribute to his younger brother. And I got some of the details about this death by listening to an audio archive where a Kerouac biographer interviewed all of Jack's friends. And there's a very distinctive accent that a lot of Lowellians have. Bill's got, where is Bill here?
Right over here.
Okay, if Bill's got, and you hear echoes of that in a lot of the people that this biographer talks to. When Pete Hood recounts what happened to his brother, and he's like, yeah, Jackie saw that. Like he's got one of those voices that's a little bit elevated and kind of loud and brassy, but when he talks about that, his voice goes way down, because I think it's something that not only he didn't recover from, but bear in mind that Jack writes about this, okay, in 1952, when the event happened in 1938, and he has kind of an uncanny recall for the details of what happened that day. So these are things that never left Jack. His mind was like a bear trap for those kinds of details, especially the more kind of gothic and sordid. And guys, for those of you just getting here, I had pointed out Billy Chandler's house, one of Jack's
16?
best. 16 is Jackie's house.
Jackson. So what street is this?
This is Phoebe Avenue.
This is Phoebe.
Yep.
That's 16
The blue house down there is 16 Phoebe Avenue. That was Jack's house.
Is that a single? Let's go take a look.
That is, to this day, yes, a single family home. I saw some interior pictures. I think it was on the market not too recently. And it's really, really nice looking house. Now, Jack's rooms in most of his houses around here were at the front on the second floor. So he will provide these, you know, kind of panoramic descriptions of the neighborhood. His buddy George Apostolos lived not in the first house here, but the second house over. And back in Jack's day, everything beyond that 3-story house there was nothing there. That was the first, Charles, I thought you might be interested in this, the first of the 2 sandbanks that Jack and his friends played in. Okay. But he was constantly across the street in George Apostolos' house. George was constantly across the street in his house. They met in 1933, so they had 33 and then 34. At the end of 34, Jack and his family actually leave, and they move right around the corner here to 35 Sarah Ave. So we'll let them kind of come down here for a second. Now, I started telling you how for a book as big and weird as that, you think about that, it's like, that's not a whole lot of, you know, like imaginative geography, but Jack could find magic in the most mundane look. These aren't sensationalism houses. These aren't special looking places.
So what about the hill where the castle would have been?
The hill where the castle would have been. That's something I'd have to show you because that's visible from the bridge.
Okay.
Now, if this looked anything like it did in Jack's day, if that were open, I might actually be able to point out one of the, or maybe two of them, the buildings that were used as models for Count Condu's castle. But it's so filled in now between UMass Lowell buildings and all of the new houses. The only place you can get that vantage point is if you're standing on the new kind of version of the Moody Street Bridge.
Right. So in Long Night of Life, he comes back in _54, and he sees the castle. He says, "This is the." He said, "I imagined it, but there it actually was there." And then they used to sled down it,
Where
the hill.
was the castle?
I want that passage.
Yeah.
I desperately want that
Well,
passage.
did you get the Buddhist years? It's in there.
Well, no, I
you
didn't
didn't
buy
get it?
anything. I didn't get one. So.
Where was the castle that he talked about?
Okay, when we get up away from traffic, I'll tell you guys as much as I know about where I think it is.
Yeah.
So, folks, this right here is probably the happiest childhood home, other than possibly West Street, that Jack ever spent time in. 35 Sarah Avenue. This house, and I have some lovely pictures that, you know, again, I haven't been able to use the binder because it's a little wet, but I have to show you at least one picture in here because it is lovely. It's Jack sitting on the front steps of this house. Yeah, I gotta go back this way a little bit more.
They look like me now doing that stuff.
Well, you know, I have my much big, I actually did these really big 11 by 14 pictures because they worked so much better during my cemetery tour, but I was just worried about them getting wet and, you know, and by the way, there's lots and lots of pictures, period specific pictures. Okay, here's Jack and his dog Beauty. I think this is 1935, 1936. Guys, you can still see the little stone wall right in the front of the house. Look on the side of the porch. You still have some of the same patterning. Okay. So there's Jack, and there used to be a pole. See where that kind of pole is on the very corner of it used to be bigger, where Jack says he would run and jump from the top of the steps and he would do 3 swirls around it and then he would land on the ground. So here he is with his dog Beauty. He's 13, maybe going on 14 years old here. Jack's room was on the 2nd floor, the one just above the porch there. And if you read part 2, okay, a gloomy book movie of Dr. Sachs, that entire section of the book is narrated from there or takes place in there, because that's where Jack plays his marble game and his horse racing game with marbles. That's where he has his writing desk. Okay, so between Phoebe Avenue and this house is when Jack, in fact, is really starting to write with some kind of discipline and purpose. And one of the most cataclysmic, now with all the death, you would think playing baseball with like a little marble in the backyard wouldn't be quite as, you know, significant as, you know, some of the other things I've told you. But one day Jack was playing baseball in the backyard, and instead of using one of his marbles, and, you know, and he had a nail that he used for a bat, he used one of his favorite marbles, which was actually a ball bearing, this big steel ball bearing. And he said he hit an end-of-the-world home run that went so far that it went all the way into the backyard of his Phoebe Avenue home. Now that's a pretty good stretch. That probably didn't happen. But what happened is that he lost that ball bearing. And that was like really, really heartbreaking for Jack. That made him, like, you know, feel like something of my childhood is gone here. So guys, one of the greatest sections of really, really focused, concentrated, geographically limited writing that Jack ever does takes place here in, you know, this particular house. So the family lived here through 35, 36, and 37. They would then move onto Moody Street to a tenement building because we're partway through the Great Depression. And what, of course, happens in 1936 Leo's printing plant is inundated by water. It flooded in the downtown area, and his business basically goes into a tailspin. So the family has less money. Leo has to take a job working for the WPA. And he hated Franklin Delano Roosevelt. He was like lugging water buckets and things like that. So they tried to make ends meet, but they just couldn't afford living in a house. And again, as I told folks, these homes were considered like the suburbs for the Franco-American citizens trying to get out of little Canada.
Yeah, it was never a very heavy Franco-American area. So it was mostly little Canada, and then of course up there by St.
But GJ lived across the street.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, but actually, if you do look, the LaFlamme family lived here, the Payette family lived here, the Kerouac family lived here, the Hood family lived here. They had an Irish family who lived next door.
Had some nerve.
Okay, and they had a Greek family who lived in Jesus and an English family, but all the other houses on Phoebe Avenue were in fact Franco-American families. And as I told, and I'll repeat it just because people might want to hear it, but when Jack is doing his tour of the backyards of all the homes on Phoebe Avenue with Dr. Sachs after meeting him, he stops in the backyard of 16 Phoebe. And while there, he talks about there's a new family living there, a family with 8 girls, and the father who lived, and it's this very, very nice little description, but Jack ends it with this kind of hint of death. Well, he's writing this in 1952. In 1954, the family who lived there, the father, Lowell police officer George Pearsall, was actually killed in the line of duty. It's the oldest unsolved murder in Lowell history. Okay. Now, you read that passage and it's a little creepy anyhow. What is Jack seeing into the future? But in fact, he probably knew something of that history because he remained in contact with a number of people who lived in this neighborhood.
Well, as I said, this is the third most important because this is where the whole Sachs thing and the real fruition and germination of his writing. And he was doing the fantasy baseball kind of stuff in there. So after the home on Beaulieu Street, where his brother died, and then again where he was born, this is the third, in my mind anyway, important of all the 10 homes he lived in, because this is where his real creativity, and it cemented his belief that this is what he was born to do and meant to do, is to be a writer.
Okay, this is a great question. This will lead me to a funny little anecdote. I think
Too many houses.
Okay, if they mark too many houses, I think it puts restrictions on what the owner can do with the house.
Yeah.
So some people don't want that historic designation because if they want to gut the house. Now, fortunately, you can look at that picture of Jackson there, and I have other much older pictures. This house looks pretty much identical. You take away some of the little balconies and stuff on 16 Phoebe, so we still have really intact sites. But this is how ignorant the neighborhood, and I'm not saying that as a judgment, but I was walking through here several years ago. I was photographing the neighborhood, trying to get some shots, especially during that right hour of the day. And I got here and I was just taking pictures, and a man comes out of the house, a big burly guy, and he said, "Hey, what are you taking pictures?" And he thought I was taking a picture of his car. I said, no, forgive me. I said, "I'm just trying to get some scenic shots of the neighborhood, and I'm hoping to at least get one of your house." He said, "Well, you want to picture my house?" I said, "Well, one of the most famous writers in American history used to live in this house. He writes about this house. It's in a number of his books." And he says, "A famous guy lived here?"
Yeah, Hemingway.
Yeah. So he kept going back and forth, and I'm like, "Yes, I have to take out my copy of Dr. Sachs," and I showed it, and he was like, he says, "Hey," he said, "Can you wait here a minute?" And I was like, "Yeah." Well, no, he went in the house and he got his cordless phone. He came outside and he dialed up, and he gets out. I'm assuming he was talking with his buddy. He said, "Hey, guess what?" He said, "Famous guy lived in my place." He's having his whole conversation, and he's yelling to me, "So what was the guy's name again?" So I'm feeding him details to tell his friend. And then I can hear the friend's getting kind of excited on the other end. At one point, the friend said, "Hey, ask him if you can make any money on this deal." So right away, he thought there might be a way to turn a
His
profit
real
on this.
estate value went up.
Guys, now Gershom Avenue extends all the way down to where it intersects with Bodwell. There are about a half dozen houses down here of some significance, places very specifically that Jack writes about. Now the Hood family, the one I told you about, they lived there. The father in that family was, well, Jack describes him in Dr. Sachs as the rheumy-eyed, sick monster old Scrooge of the block. Not a very flattering description. So he's kind of a cranky old guy. At one point in time, he kicked his wife and all of his kids out of the house. Get out. And they had to move, you know, down here. So when things sort of softened between the family, Kerouac describes how the kids would, you know, shuffle from one house to the next, depending on what the kind of state of, you know, interpersonal affairs happened to be. The one house I did want to tell you about, just a few down here on Gershom, lived a guy named Victor Sawyer, another one of Jack's childhood buddies. They played sandlot baseball together, but it was also where Jack probably got his first taste of serious alcohol. And here's why. Victor Sawyer's father, a gentleman named, not making this up, Josephat, Jopeshat, Josephat Sawyer, made his own cherry wine, and he had a fairly extensive collection of bottles in the basement. So one day Vic says, hey Jack, you got to come check this out, something I've been getting into. So they went down there and they started drinking off a little bit from any number of bottles. Well, this went on for a little while until the father one day started noticing, hey, those levels in the bottles are not right. So he started putting a lock on it. So Jack actually, that was a place they used to congregate, and Sawyer also had a little shack in the backyard that had a small pool table in it. So between the clubhouse behind 16 Phoebe and this, they had their, like, you know, little out of the way places, get away from their parents, but also Jack got his first taste of what I'm assuming was, you know, pretty good homemade brew, especially since it didn't gag him after the first time. So Gershom Ave is also pretty significant. Now in 1937, Caroline Kerouac marries a gentleman named Charles Morissette. Yeah. The marriage doesn't last long. It's actually a rather unhappy marriage for Caroline, but that marriage does produce a couple of interesting biographical tidbits that involve Jack. The first of which is this, okay? After Jack came back from Horace Mann, just before his first year at Columbia University, the family had moved into this tenement, which was not only cheaper yet from the one on Moody Street, but because it was at least partly owned by the Morissette family, they got a deal on being here. And it is this house they were living in when one night Jack is in his room just writing, and he hears a voice on the street say, hey, Jack Kerouac. Jack goes, what? And he said, Jack Kerouac. So finally comes outside and he sees this curly-haired Greek-looking guy standing out in the street. Turns out to be Sammy Sampis. Sebastian Sammy Sampatakakis, okay? In fact, the younger brother of the woman Jack would marry in 1966. His friendship had already been cemented with Sammy Sampis when they went to the Bartlett together, but they kind of got reacquainted here, and they had one of those magical summers spending time together, reading poetry, talking about books. And Sampis was a very, very demonstrative. He, much like Billy Chandler, Jack's other friend, they wrote plays, they did like radio plays, they created their own little theater troupe. But Sammy Sampis ends up being a very, very important character in the Kerouac story, not just because they were great friends. He was the first really like heavily artistically influenced of Jack's friends, but he also ends up dying in World War II at Anzio Beachhead. Now, he wasn't a soldier, he was a medic, and he got injured, caught in the crossfire, and he ended up dying from his injuries. So there's a whole long list of bodies, you know,
That's
that
the
Jack.
reason why Jack wanted to be buried, because
If there's
they were
any-
old.
yeah.
Because that's where Sammy was buried.
Yeah.
Because everybody else in the family is up in Nashua. So, and say years ago,
Was that the Sampises?
There's some debate about exactly who made that call, but if there is any reason at all why Jack is buried, now this is going to sound a little harsh, so forgive me. If there's a reason why Jack is buried in Edson, it's not necessarily because Stella's there. I think if given the choice, he would have wanted to be there because Sammy was there. Because they were very, very intensely close. Their correspondence with one another. You know, Jack wrote Sebastian a letter after he died. Okay, and it's really it's kind of painful to read. You know, he's trying to dredge some good out of the whole thing. But anyhow, so they got reacquainted right here. And Jack's standing on the porch, and Sammy says, hey, and Jack's like, hey, what do you want? He says, I just been wanting to meet you, you know? Every time we saw you at school and we met on the sandbank, Jack defended him one time against the bully, okay? And he says, I heard you're interested in writing in books. What are you reading? And Jack mentions a couple of writers, and Sammy says, oh, they're okay. You know, getting ready to critique his choices. But he was the first person who provides a sort of, you know, kind of almost like a doppelganger, you know, for the kind of artist figure that Jack himself was slowly becoming. So they become good buddies. They maintain a very, very healthy correspondence. And one of the more magical nights in Jack's young adolescence is when he, Sammy Santos, and Billy Chandler go about a mile and a half down here, maybe not even that far, to what they called Bare Ass Beach, okay? Which was basically just a little beach, but they went there, they bought books of poetry, they slept out overnight, and they read poetry, and they sang songs, and they just had one of those nights where the time flew by, a real bonding night that they had together. So when Jack loses both of those young men to World War II, okay, he writes elegies for them. He continues writing, you know, texts that are inspired by or that are almost like written to these people. So their losses were, you know, did help produce some pretty good literature. But it also, again, this gaping void of, you know, of absences that building up for Jack just keeps accruing. So this is the second to last house that he lives in the Pawtucketville area. We're going to head up to this intersection here to see. Hello.
How are you?
Good.
Kurt, that's not the one where he talks about the mother on the porch that's going to fall in.
No, that's just around the corner.
Okay.
Yep. The LeBlanc family used to live here. Jack calls them the Lenoir family. Jack knew them through the Pawtucketville Social Club. But one of the brothers in that family, Victor LeBlanc, used to pretend to be a character called the Moon Man. Okay, so if you read any of those accounts of the hijinks of Jack and his gang of friends, they would actually like see one of these guys all of a sudden up in a tree. They'd be playing on the sandbank, and one of these guys would come flying out of the tree and scare the bejesus out of everybody. Well, one of them developed a routine he used to do, and supposedly it was Victor LeBlanc, where he actually would keep a small bottle of gasoline with him, ingest a little bit of it, and then with a match, and produce this big flame that he would blow out as he was jumping out of the tree. Of course, he used to scare the hell out of all of the kids, but it was, you know, one of those characters. And the memory of that was strong enough for Jack that he writes about it in Dr. Sachs. And this used to be Blaison's corner store, one of Jack's favorite little shops. He and his friend hung out in front of it. And do you know why they liked that shop? This little tiny place had the only pinball machine, okay, in the neighborhood. So they used to like to go in there and play pinball, thumb through the pulp magazines. But now we're at, and thank God at least the building is going to exist even if the organization doesn't. This, guys, is the Pawtucketville Social Club. It, like the Moody Street Bridge, has been in Pawtucketville, or at least the original Moody Street Bridge. They kind of came into being at the same time, 1897, 1898. This place was not just a social center, it was a place that folks could go from the Franco-American community, kind of help them prepare to become U.S. citizens, okay? So it was a social center, it was a place to drink, it was a place to play pool. Jack basically says it was just a big streaming, you know, kind of wild pool hall, but it did serve a function. It gave the community a group of people, concerned people, who could lobby their interests, you know, to the city politicians, which helped in fact make Pawtucketville a much more actively engaged in the democratic process community, but it also allowed these people to live a higher standard of life. So the Pawtucketville Social Club, Jack's father managed it for a couple of years. I've got articles from the Local Sun where he talks about, like, you know, opening the bowling, because they had duck pin bowling lanes in here, opening the lanes for, you know, like they would have like some big competition for a fundraiser. So they say, and you know, this organization thanks Leo Kerouac for the generous donation of the bowling lane. So he kept all the paper here, you know, he was, you know, pretty important here for a while. And then he finally, you know, his term as, you know, as the boss kind of ended. But the Kerouac family retained close ties here because this is where Leo used to like to come and drink and carouse with maybe his best friend, Mike Fournier, Michel Fournier, who he'd known all the way back to his days over in Centerville. Now, I need to say something about this house across the road here. Bill may have something else to say about the social club, but this is, okay, this is a tenement where one of Jack's best friends, a kid named Freddie Bertrand, who he renamed Vinny Bergerac, lived here. Now, the reason Jack liked this place is that it was not only close to his homes over here, but if he was on his way to school and somebody said, I don't want to go to school today, he says, yeah, but where are we going to go? Let's go to Vinny's and play hooky. Okay, so this became what Jack describes as his suicide hooky house. Okay, now nobody committed suicide, but they would engage in some pretty rambunctious behavior. Smoking cigarettes, eating, there was a little bit of drinking going on. And the parents in the family were both actually pretty liberal, although they're also kind of saucy. So they'd be sitting in the midst of this chaos, just the radio blasting, drinking a little bit, smoking, having a good time, all the while everyone thinking that they'd gone to school down in the other end of town. So this building also used to house, in the lowest floor, okay, the absolute favorite of all the markets here in Pawtucketville. Jack talks about it, names it in any number of his Lowell texts. He either calls it Parents or Lambert's. Lambert Brothers had a grocery store here, and the descriptions of the place in Jack's books are absolutely luminous. He said there was always like a gold light in the place. This is where they would come for, if they needed meat for one of their parties, for general groceries. They would even come here and buy their Christmas trees, as he describes in Memory Bay, this wonderful little novella about the time that he lived here. So if you want to read descriptions, okay, and there was a grocery store here for 50 years, okay, and it only closed with the death of the proprietor, whose name was Albert Lambert. So
now this only closed 20 years ago. And when I first started marching around there after Roger Brunel was not able to do this, you had to really, it was like a speakeasy. This door was locked. You'd have to knock on the door and they'd look at you, and for a while we couldn't get in there. So I finally was able to, you know, talk to somebody, and they said, oh, okay, this is a different story. The bar was on the right-hand side, and the pool table, the original table that Jack would have played with on the pool and Leo and so on, and unfortunately it closed down a few years ago. There was an attempt made, I think, to turn this into a restaurant, an Asian restaurant.
It is. It's going to be opening.
Is it?
Yeah.
But the pool table is still in there.
Yes.
That's
and one
it.
of the members of the Facebook Kerouac group was like, we got to do something to like fight, because it is actually the pool table. In 1967, the Canadian Broadcasting Company sent a documentary crew here to Lowell, and they filmed Jack playing pool inside this place, just hanging out with him, and they interviewed people in here. And they were like, you know, they're going up to Jack, and it gives you a pretty different portrait, because supposedly Jack was nothing but a drunken bum. Nobody had anything but nice things to say about him. Oh, Jackie's a good boy. Yeah, he comes in here and he plays pool with us, and no, we don't have any problems with him, you know. And Jack's smoking his cigarette, looks at, you know, he's got his check shirt on, looks just like, and they filmed inside here, and that aired in an episode of a kind of sort of interview program on Canadian television that, you know, has since become sort of, I don't know, legendary, because it's one of the few interviews that you see ever done with Jack, and Jack looks comfortable. because it's all done in French. And despite the fact that the audience sometimes kind of laughs, they don't always understand his accent because, by the way, the French spoken here in Lowell, as Roger was very, very clear about pointing out, was just enough different, okay? And of course that was way different from Parisian French, that sometimes those little variations on Montreal Joual dialect, okay, weren't always easily recognizable. But Jack is smiling. Now Jack is wearing shoes that look like he's run about 15 marathons in them. You know, his pants are kind of high water. He's wearing that you know, that check shirt, but you will rarely, if ever, see him look more comfortable when he's got media watching him, because the guy's asking questions about his family. You know, he's asking really decent questions and not trying to ambush him or make him look bad. And he gets really kind of choked up watching the video footage that they made, especially when people were saying nice things about it. I think that meant more than all of the praise he could have gotten from the New York literary establishment.
There
That's
are
just my
still
opinion.
4 operating social clubs in this city. 3 of them are in the Centerville
And they're all
section.
closed down.
No, they're not.
Well, the Centerville Social is closed down, isn't it?
The Don Polsky still operates. That
Yeah,
one is.
yeah.
The
And then
Polsky is.
The other one they tore down in Viega, and
Yeah.
the Pastime still. And
Well,
this
the
one's on
Positano is still there.
Yeah, the Pastime.
That's still operating. And then in my neighborhood, there's the Portuguese Club.
Yeah,
And that's very active.
Yeah.
And I think, as Kurt said, these were places where people were sort of given what happened to become American citizens. They weren't just bars per se. And so to me to still say that you had these clubs were still operating, you know, again, of being of a Polish background, the Don Polsky, that's what they were. And they didn't say you have to be Polish to get in here, or Portuguese. It was pretty, I mean, most it would have been, they would have people of those ethnic backgrounds, that they were really ways that people to come in here who are coming in fresh from overseas, wherever, and to become part of the American dream. And they help them become citizenship, the whole process for that. But it's a shame. In fact, the lettering was still up here.
They took it down.
And that's gone. So God knows what that is. There's probably one of the canals right now floating in the way to Lawrence.
Now guys, I told you about Zapku Park, the haunted park that none of the boys in Pawtucketville would go in after Roland Hood ended up dying. That park, as Jack describes, extends all the way here to Moody Street. So from here to here, Jack used to go to his favorite kind of comic book store and his kind of candy store just down the road a little bit, and then the shortcut home would be here. He wouldn't go back to Riverside and, you know, up Phoebe or, you know, or down here to Gershon. He just cut across, but not after Roland Hood died. And he describes in the book, this is where we used to play basketball. Now it's interesting they have basketball courts here. There weren't basketball courts here in Jack's day, but they did have a big, like, vegetable or fruit basket nailed up to a tree, and they used to play basketball there. And Jack describes these titanic battles that used to take place between the Hood brothers, who always played on different teams because they were both fiercely competitive. Bill, let's do this on our way back. I just want to go down one more block. I've had somebody ask about one of the other sites, and then we'll come back here and then we can talk about this tenement. Yeah. A word that has come up in a number of the analyses of Jack's Lowell books. I've seen Dr. Teachin here from UMass Lowell, and Hassan Malahi uses the word, but the word is ethnography or ethnographic, okay? Jack provides you with a lot of ethnographic detail about the neighborhood he grew up in. So why take the time to tell us where the grocery store was? Right across the street here, there was a very famous drugstore. Brunel's Pharmacy was here, run by a gentleman named Lucien Brunel. Jack calls him bourgeois, and he gives this really interesting description of the place. Interesting footnote in Jack's biography. The notary public / justice of the peace who signed off on his paperwork, his Navy paperwork, was Lucien Brunel, the guy who owned this place. He was also actively involved in political life and civic life for the Franco-American community. But the Egg Roll Cafe used to be a grocery store. Jack describes that. This shop used to be, again, a drugstore. He describes that. There used to be a garage here, and right here was the most important store on this street for Jack. This is where Détouche's Candy used to be. Détouche's Candy was actually the Moody Street variety store run by a gentleman named Joseph Desjardins. And Joseph Desjardins appears to be one of the sketchier characters in the neighborhood. Now, he was the subject of cruel rumors and all kinds of innuendo. He walked with a pronounced kind of foot-dragging limp. He spoke with a lisp. He constantly had runny eyes, okay? And he would make the kids get their own candy. Like, he couldn't even reach, you get the candy and put the penny in my hand. But this store is where Jack used to like to get his shadow magazines. It's where he used to get his candy, and he tells us in Dr. Sachs when he got older, this became his tobacco shop. This is where he used to like to buy tobacco. Joseph Desjardins is named Détouche as a nod to the actual name of one of Jack's favorite and most influential novelists, a guy named Louis Ferdinand Céline, the Frenchman who wrote Journey to the End of the Night. He's kind of a disreputable guy. He was also very much, you know, he's kind of a misanthrope, not a very nice guy, but his actual given last name was Détouche. So Jack trying to sort of telegraphs the ambiguous nature of that character here. But this used to be a market. It was here and open until well into the 70s, but after 1958, when Joe Desjardins died, it was run by his son, Raymond. And the only, well, I think I might have at least one photo in here if anyone cares to see it. Just really quickly. It's a little bit more period specific, okay? There we go, right here. Oh, and by the way, here's the Lambert's grocery store. That's the one I described on there, and there's Arthur Lambert. And this is Textile Variety Store. This is after the street, okay? Well, and it's interesting, it still says Moody Street here, but this is where the store was. You can see there's still enough similarity to it here, but it used to be a bank for a while, and this is the one known photograph. I got it from the Lowell Sun of Joe Desjardins. So he looks a little bit like, if you put like an old pointed cap on him, he looks like an elf or something. You know, he just needs a little pointed beard. So yeah, so Jack gives you a whole sense. It wasn't just his house and his imagination. There was a real world here, a real community. It had commerce going on. And in fact, from that street where the Wrinkly Tar corner is, all the way down about 2 or 3 blocks, this was the commercial district of Pawtucketville for the entire time Jack lived here.
Wasn't this what Textile Lunch was?
Yeah, folks, right on the corner here, there used to be a little confectioner. Celida Foucher, or Foucher, depending on how you pronounce it, had a little candy store here. And her family ran a place called the Textile Lunch. Jack describes the Textile Lunch as being this greasy spoon sort of place. You could go in late night and get, you know, hamburgers with ketchup and onion on it, right? He describes that. This is the place he's talking about. Jack lived above this place. In fact, on the 4th floor, I'll show you right where his room was. But this place was sort of a beacon for Jack late nights because, like lots of businesses at the time, it was open almost 24 hours a day. In fact, you had a lot of businesses open almost 24 hours a day in Jack's day. And why would that be? The mills
lived there.
Yeah, the mills actually worked 24 hours a day, so hungry workers needed places to eat. So for folks who actually lived in this community, this was their like 24-hour, their late night eatery. Now, Jack could have gotten his candy here because he lived just, he lived up on the top floor of this. So why did he go down there? He said this place was too neat. It smelled too good. He liked gloomy, tromping, gray candy stores like Détouche's, okay? So Jack had standards when it came to where he would buy his candy.
It was on a corner.
Where was Lambert?
So where was Lambert? It was that corner?
Yep. If we stand right here,
Yeah.
that whole building, the whole first floor,
Right.
that was all Lambert. So yeah, if you look at the picture, and there was a big sign there at the time, but there were also tenements Most of the businesses were on the first floor and the tenements were up above. So when Jack came down, the middle door on this building is where Jack would come out if he was coming out the front entrance.
He lived on the 4th floor?
In fact, that dark window right up there in the corner on the 4th floor is where Jack's room was. So folks, that's the room that Jack used to come back to after a long night of track practice, catching the bus, going down to South Lowell, you know, kind of flirting a little bit with, you know, Maggie Cassidy / Mary Carney. And one night he describes a 3-mile long walk he takes home all the way from South Lowell to this apartment. As he starts getting closer to here, he had a game he played with himself. I love it, okay? He'd look at houses and go, oh, that's a nice looking house. I wonder if nice people live there. Maybe I'll go into that house. So he would do that up and down the block until he got to his own. He said, well, that's a really nice looking house. Let me go into that. And of course, it's where he lived. But this actually tells you how far their financial fortunes had fallen by the time actually they get here, because they had a single floor up here,
Right.
okay, as opposed to an entire house to themselves. They were still pretty centrally located.
So when they had when they took the picture, when he like he and Mary Carney are there, they have the party. That was the party for.
That's actually a few blocks away from here.
Okay.
But
And so that was after this. Right. Okay.
Well, no, it's while they were living here. In fact, guys, I can show you if somebody has a light. This is the textile lunch, okay, and the tenement from the backside, much more how it looked. This was taken in the 1970s. So this is the little balcony somebody asked about, where Gabrielle used to sit out there with one part of her chair, the back legs of her chair inside and the front legs of her chair on the outside, just in case that little balcony would give way, okay? And this is Jack and his sister. They used to have a porch here on the first floor, and this is the two of them sitting there. This dates from this probably dates from shortly before she got married, so I'm saying this is probably when they first moved in here, but I don't have any definitive information. So anyhow, and for those of you who've never seen pictures of Jack as an athlete, if you ever want to aspire to get your legs developed, okay, this is what you want him to look like. He had the most powerful looking legs, which is why he was such a fantastic sprinter and running back. They couldn't bring him down. If you didn't get him on the first tackle, you couldn't bring him down because he low center of gravity, but he also had incredibly powerful legs. And all of that stuff, that time period, Maggie Cassidy, this is where it happens. And he has one of the most beautiful descriptions of what he could see, the neighborhood that he could see, the people walking the streets, all the way down to St. Jean d'Arc Church, okay, the lights of the businesses, okay. It's really, really beautiful stuff. So for people who say, well, Kerouac couldn't write, you know, he no sense of characterization, his plot stunk, and I want to go, well, not only do I disagree about that, but some of his descriptions of landscape and place are just breathtaking. They're not only beautiful, but they're incredibly accurate. You can open up Dr. Sachs down just beyond Lambert's, start at that corner, follow all the way down this street, and he will even tell you where the alleys are. And guess what? They're still in the same place they were back in Jack's day. So why does he do all of that? Well, to rescue this kind of, these kinds of places from the historical oblivion they're consigned to. You know, that was part of the whole survivance thing for French Canadian people. They were proud that they owned their own businesses. They were proud that they had communities. So the fact that these aren't French Canadian communities anymore, well, you know, that's kind of sad, but they are still vibrant. Okay, a lot of college kids, and you still see a lot of diversity of faces and belief systems. And you know, I've always wanted to just go and interview everybody in the neighborhood any given night and ask how many actually know who Jack Kerouac is, because I think that would probably be rather sobering. So now, did you want to go down to White, or do you want to continue on our way down this way, Bill?
Well, we might as well go to White.
Yeah, we'll just head down a couple of blocks to White and we'll walk straight down. Our ultimate goal is going to be
walk up the street here and take the right.
Oh yeah, we can take yeah. Okay, I didn't know if you wanted to just backtrack here. Cherry tour. At one point in time, folks, one of the greatest billiards players in the world lived right here in Lowell. He was native to Lowell. He lived in this house here at 23 Crawford Street. His name was Andrew St. John. If you've ever read Dr. Sachs, there's a description where Jack talks about being in the Pawtucketville Social Club one night in St. Louis, who was nicknamed the Shadow, okay, by Jack, comes in and plays pool. The most amazing pool player you've ever seen. It seemed like his fingers were 10 inches long. When he hit a shot, it was perfect. That's a real guy. His family lived here. They used to own a billiards parlor over in Centerville, and that's where he perfected his skills. And this is the cool fact about him. In addition to being one of the best pool players in the world, he did play for the World Championship in 1928. He lost to his drinking buddy, Ralph Greenleaf. He also did promotion. He's one of the first athletes I know of that actually did promotional work for a product. He actually worked for the Coca-Cola Corporation. He would actually go into like bars, community centers, social clubs, things like that, dressed up as the masked Marvel. Like literally, mask, black outfit, and he would challenge people to play pool against him. All the while hawking, you know, Coca-Cola products, Coca-Cola beverages, and everybody get a free bottle of Coca-Cola, etc. But he'd play people. Now, he couldn't be beaten. In fact, he used to challenge and play most of them one-handed and still beat people. But he's one of those guys who's sort of a footnote in Lowell history, sadly, despite the fact of just how good he was. In fact, Willie Mosconi, who a lot of people say might have been the greatest billiards player of all time, once said, Andrew St. John was the best pool player of all time from the neck down. He couldn't quite get his head on straight. And in fact, he died in his early 50s. Basically the same reason why Jack died. He died of chronic alcoholism and cirrhosis. Now, you asked the question, I wanted to point it out, Charles. This big tenement building right here, this one in the corner, if you go down right where that white car is parked, there's a little driveway that leads down there. There's another tenement behind there. That is the tenement where 45 Crawford Street is. That's where Carolyn Morissette, Kerouac, was living with her first husband, and where that famous, or I should say, where those famous photographs of Jack were shot at his 17th birthday party on the night of a big blizzard here in March of 1939. Jack describes both of those photos in great detail. What's interesting to look at, the photos are great and Jack's descriptions of them are very thought-provoking. But underneath both pictures, they had little stories about that. Now, the birthday of one of Lowell's most talented athletes made the newspaper, right? Okay, but we also have the name of every single person who was at the party. And Jack has, there's some interesting romantic complications going on because Jack, of course, was completely taken with Mary Carney, Maggie Cassidy, but at the same time, there were a couple of other guys at the party who also had their eyes on her. So one of the reasons why Jack looked a little bit, you know, pensive in the, you know, the couple of photos was that he was worried about who might be in the other room, because in one of the photographs, Mary Carney's not in it. So she was in the other room with someone else, and she later told Jack that she was just being friendly with some of the other boys. Yeah. 54. Jack was back in Lowell, and you kind of know what mental turmoil was going on for him at the time. And he was looking for any kind of spiritual guidance, any way out of the sort of rut that he was in. Well, this had been his parish church when he lived in Pawtucketville. This is St. John Dark Church. He went in here, he sat down to do some praying, you know, kind of meditating. And it's here, while he was at this church, that the idea of beat, as meaning not downtrodden or having anything to do with a musical beat, but beat as beatitude, as beatific, came to him. Here he had kind of a religious epiphany of a sort. Okay. Most of Jack's great epiphanies, okay, if they didn't happen here, they were kind of perfected, or they flowered here in a way. So Jack made that connection here, and if you look at the way he thinks about beat, and he writes about beat, you know, post October 1954, you get, you know, the result of, you know, what he discovered here, which is pretty special stuff. And if more folks had been willing to humor that, as opposed to just see him as some kind of beatnik. And I heard somebody talking today, anytime anyone tries to sell me on this idea that it's okay, we should embrace the term beatnik, blah blah blah. It's like that was a pejorative, you know, on a par with some of the ugly racial invective that you can use against different ethnic groups. It's like, I'm never going to be comfortable using that term, especially to describe Jack. Maybe not even comfortable using beat, but beatific, yeah, I'm pretty comfortable with that. But anyhow, we were able to, one of Roger's last years doing the tour, we were able to get inside these buildings, and the congregation that meets here, really, really great. I mean, they're sort of, you know, they're called the Fusion Church because I think they kind of bring people from various ethnic group and different, you know, denominations of one faith or another here. So yeah, and structurally, this building has been saved and is in pretty good shape.
Well,
and
the church was built and established as a church, parish church, in 1929.
Mm-hmm.
And the real tragedy, when they were shutting down churches years ago, because of dwindling populations and so forth, this church was financially sound, and there were a lot of people that went there, and the archdiocese just, they shut it down.
They kind of screwed the folks here.
They
yeah.
even petitioned Rome. You had this process where that if you thought the archdiocese, the diocese, was not really handling the situation right, you could appeal to this board in the Vatican. But they rarely would turn down a cardinal's request to shut it down. I think it was cardinal law, and they went in and shut it down. And it was people got very understandably embittered about that.
Mm-hmm.
Because it wasn't in financial straits, and it was very well supported. But that's just what happened. So there's a lot of ugliness left over from those days. The church I grew up in, well, a lot of people just moved out of Lowell, especially in the 1970s, when this city had one of the highest, if not the highest, unemployment rates in the entire country.
Oh, watch out, a little bunny there on the sidewalk.
Oh,
You see him?
look at that.
There we go. I think he's okay. Safe for now. There we go.
So the church is just, they had to close them down. In fact, they were going to sell that church, St. Peter's. UMass Lowell was interested as a concert hall, but there was so much water damage done over the years because one of the pastors there, back in those days, the local pastor was in charge of all the finances. There was no such thing as turning the money in per se to the archdiocese. This is when Richard Cardinal Cushing was the Archbishop Cardinal of Boston, and he was not liked very well in Rome because he was kind of a wild card. He was dedicating the cornerstone for a Masonic temple, and the people in Rome just hit the roof and said, oh, you know, he just told them to go to hell. And so when that was going on with Cushing and so on, there was a huge archdiocesan debt. So they brought in an outsider named Cardinal Humberto Medeiros, who came from the Azores originally, his family. And Medeiros was able to come in here and straighten the finances out because Cushing was like a sailor on leave. He raised tons and tons of money, but he spent tons and tons of money too. But he was he's a guy that came out of South Boston. He was a real beloved street, non-typical, sort of like Cardinal Francis Spellman was a real patrician type guy out of New York, and so Spellman hated Cushing and all these kind of things. So that's what happened. It was really terrible. They came in because a lot to do with finances and so. But at least you just say we were able to get inside there, and they're very welcoming, and it's pretty. You can tell looking at it. This isn't a building that's falling down. My church was so weakened by years of damage when the pastor was there, he refused to fix it. They had to get telephone poles to prop up the tower so it wouldn't fall across the street and hit the Superior Courthouse. And as an altar boy, I used to remember climbing up the ladders to this place, and I could see the concrete was just falling off between the massive granite blocks. And when I wasn't killed, they never would have found me in a million years until they tore the building down. So that's the way it was. So when Medeiros came in here, he said, that's it. All this money is coming in from the pastors. That's going into the archdiocese. Boston, the financial committee, because these guys, well, they all grew up with Cushing and his classmates. So if Cushing would say, well, I want this money reform going, they'd tell him, hey, no, cut it out. You know, you're an old buddy of ours, don't tell us what the hell to do. Because Monsignor means, as you know in French, my lord. And when my local pastor, a guy named Jack Twist, although to this Twist's credit, he stopped the connector from bulldozing back Central Street neighborhood in the urban renewal days.
That's a big deal.
And when Twist became Monsignor, and I was an altar boy, and I said, well, I said, congratulations. And I said to him, my Lord. He called my mother up and said I was fresh. But I mean, that's the way it was. But this is a tragedy when this thing went out like that, because there's no reason for it. But as Kurt mentioned, this is important because this is the whole thing about beatitude, beatific, not picnic.
Yeah, and guys, it's also worth pointing out, every one of these Franco-American kind of communities or neighborhoods, they all had three things. They all had a parish church, they all had a parish parochial school, and they all had some kind of social center. I mean, those were, you brought those things, that kind of thinking came from Canada with the nearly 1 million Franco-American immigrants that came to New England between 1840 and 1930. This was something that's like, you need this because you need to reinforce the culture, because there were some people who felt like when you come here, you should just assimilate. Give up your language, give up the, whatever the American dream was. But they felt like, their part of the American dream was to kind of retain some of these cultural vestiges. And I just think, all of the remarkable stuff that happened to Jack, either in his parochial schools or, in these churches, like the idea of these places like just disappearing, people giving up on them. I don't know, that just kind of makes me sick to my stomach. So, okay, here, maybe it's not important to a lot of people, but the fact that he had one of his most important kind of epiphanies here, I think that warrants at least some consideration when you're thinking about, I don't know, like bulldozing a place, which is sad enough in and of itself. That we're going downhill here, and that plays a definite role in the story we're going to tell when we get to the end of White Street. Folks, as much as you'll be able to see it, this home is this one right here. This is 12 White Street. This was the home of a woman named Helen Mansfield. Miss Mansfield was one of the most important educators in Jack's life. She was one of his teachers over at the Bartlett School, and in fact, she was one of 2 faculty members who ran something called the Scribblers Club, which was the first kind of organized place and sort of writing salon that Jack had where he could share his writing with other people. So long after he stopped going to school here in Lowell, but when he had friends who still lived in town or he came in town, he would often try to look up Miss Mansfield. That's how important she was to him. Well, she also figures in one of the more dramatic episodes in Dr. Sachs, because her house, and in case you noticed, we came downhill and we're like in a bowl down here. Okay, her house is in this photograph here. Okay, now we'll take a look at this from out on the main drag. Okay, but her house was right in an area that was devastated by the flood. In fact, Jack talks about the efforts to sandbag and get the streets set up to kind of block the floodwaters, because it had overspilled the banks and it was threatening to inundate this whole area. So Jack talks about going here, and he and his friends are like trying to poke holes in the, the sandbags so they can the flood can come through. But then they realize the water just keeps getting higher and it gets scarier and scarier. So there are a couple photographs I have. They weren't taken after the peak of the flood, okay, but it's pretty darn close to it. So the water, okay, is about, still at this point, is about, look at this back porch here, it's about halfway up. That's how much, okay? So that would probably be about 6 or 7 feet. That's a couple of feet below where it actually crested. These photographs were taken after the flood's peak. So this whole area was just swimming underwater. And Jack writes in great detail about that and how afterwards he's like, oh, I guess I didn't want those sandbags to give out. You know, this thing is like this, and he describes it as serpent-like, you know, hinting towards the great world snake. That's part of the culmination of the book. Well, you know, he saw this thing as like, it's impacting the lives of real people. So one of Jack's favorite school teachers, who he calls Miss Wakefield, is actually Helen Mansfield, who is buried not too far from Jack in Edson Cemetery. One of his favorite school teachers, and someone whose life, like lots of Lowellians, his friend Scotty Beaulieu, his friend Harry Charity, all of the folks who lived out in the Rosemont district, which we didn't even talk about, they were all flooded out, okay? And one of the stops we made on my cemetery tour, and I like to point this one out, is Lowell lost 3 people. 3 folks died in the flood. One of them was a young man named Alfie Morin. He makes it into Dr. Sachs. Jack renames him Roger Boyer, or Roger Boyer, and talks about, did you hear the little boy who died in the flood? Oh, he's related to the guy who runs the grocery store. And, you know, it's like, yeah, he drowned. And it's a true story. This young man was out. He lived in the Little Canada section of the city. He was trying to spear driftwood and bring it to the shore. He had a barb on the end of a long stick, okay? But he made the mistake of tying the stick to a piece of rope around his waist. He speared a log. He got pulled into the water. The water was so high and was going so fast, 60 miles per hour they estimate, he stood no chance. So he's one of 3 casualties, 3 people who actually drowned in that flood. And Jack even writes about that person. So that history would be lost to us. And when I point out his headstone, this little modest thing, I said, some people guess that that's how he died, because he died in 36. But yet another young man who died during Jack's span living in Pawtucketville. So it's a book that's haunted by death, and the fact that it's as exuberant and ultimately, I think, positive and affirmative as it is testament to Jack's not just creativity, but a thread of optimism that I think runs through all of his books. By the way, what are the last 2 words in Dr. Sachs? Be a good way to end our last 2 words.
The end.
By God. By God.
If it was light enough, you could see where the flood pushed in part of the wall.
Mm-hmm.
And where the second floor window is above the light in the porch, on that corner where the eave is, that's actually not in true alignment with the rest of the house.
Yeah, you can't see it very well this time of day, but Roger pointed that out to us on one of the tours, and you're like, that tells you. So guys, if you lived on the second floor, maybe you could have, I don't know, survived, but if you lived on the first floor, and by the way, this wasn't a tenement, this wasn't a duplex. The only person who lived in this house was the Mansfield family.
Back in 2006, the so-called Mother's Day flood was amazing. This whole area got flooded again. Not quite as badly as it was, but it was the lower side, Rosemont, by the bend of the river. People were in the streets with boats, and they were actually able to fish because the water was so high.
Yeah, I remember one of the houses, once the waters went back down, they still had a whole bunch of carp in their backyard.
Yeah, that was amazing. And they, where the Pawtucket Falls are, you could not see the falls because the drop there, the 26-foot drop, was level with the lower part of the river. And I remember standing there, I got pictures of it. And I was out by the boat mills, and all of a sudden, within a few minutes, the water was coming right up in almost to my ankles. So I had to get the hell out of there very fast. And so all of this was level. You could not. These are the wood floodgates, and the water was even with the river.
The water was actually 20 feet above the top of the dam. There's this house here, guys. You can see from the bridge if you walk back. This used to be a blacksmith shop here.
Still there.
It's still there. It's like literally all the way up to the cusp of the roof here. And when you look at that, you're like, no, that can't have been that high. That would have, it would. And you're like, in that water, like literally, like the drop off disappeared. I mean, you got a little bit of that movement, but that's how scary this was. All of the bridges sustained damage. The bridge into Centerville over near the Kerouac Commemorative was ripped right out. It was folded in on itself. Now, for all of that, the Moody Street Bridge, which supposedly was so structurally frail, and there's some amazing photographs. The water was almost right up underneath that thing. It was scary how people standing up on there kind of watching.
It held.
Right? It held.
That's
No
why
major
when
structural
they were tearing
damage.
that thing down, that bridge was structurally safe. And the city says, oh, well, it would cost tons of repairs because the state said, we'll sell you the thing for $1. And they pull that nonsense up. I said, that's crap. That bridge is structurally sound.
So guys, these are the underbeams of the bridge. The water had risen. It was 20 feet above like it's normal. I mean, just insane stuff. But from here, you know, down to the rocks is a 70-foot drop. So you do the math here. This is insane. And look, those are people standing up there. And the Aiken Street Bridge held up pretty good, and this one did, but there were actually a number of bridges that sustained significant damage that had to be replaced. They had to be significantly, you know, kind of refurbished afterwards. Just, you know, I don't know. And it's part of Lowell's history, and it's part of Kerouac history, and that's why I wish, out of all the places that have gone, that Moody Street Bridge, that's the one that's bothered me, I think, the most. Because the views of the old, and is the person who asked about the castle here? No, I don't think so. But you had a view to Centerville, and there was this family, the mansion, the Hildreth mansion, but then there's this little turreted home up on Whitney Avenue that normally I think Bill goes through that area on his walking tour. But there were two places you could see from the Moody Street Bridge, and if the lights were on in one or the other of them, like, it was pretty impressive view. So Jack actually talks about that. He used to imagine what was going on. And once his mind started going, he's like, I wonder, like, vampires live there, like, in monsters, and, you know, they got dark rituals going on in the bay, and they've got, like, you know, like little slave men digging a big hole to freeze it. I mean, just all of the craziness of that, those fanciful kind of phantasmagoric sections of the book. But that's a view that we no longer have because it's not quite the same alignment. And only one of those places exists. So, you know, I don't know. I get a little sentimental about this stuff, but what do I know? See, I'm not from Lowell. I understand that folks here in Lowell have their own priorities. So,
Well, thank you very much, because thank you, Kurt, for your encyclopedic, you know, insights, and for us for making the tour on this rather chilly night.
And thank you guys in particular. You've been, I think, was it 2 or 3 tours you did here?
We were with Bill yesterday.
Yeah.
You did the downtown tour with me, right? And you did this
No,
one.
we did the
years ago. Years ago.
3 years ago we did the downtown.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Well, see, I thought you were with me. So see, that's